The foundational document of our society is something called the Declaration of Independence. In it are the words, the foundational words of all that we do, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Included among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It says in that document that God bestows or grants certain rights. And what has been bestowed as a gift at one time has suddenly become demanded today. Either through riot, through anger, the end of a gun, or with the throw of a Molotov cocktail, people say, I have the right. And it's only human for us to feel that way in some ways. After all, you don't like to be told what to do. If you get in the roadway today, if you get on the roads and you see it on almost every road, you come to a concrete barrier on one side and the median strip with another concrete barrier on the other side, and you don't feel good about that, especially if there's a truck behind you. And you don't like the feeling of restriction. You want the feeling of freedom and openness. We don't like for someone to tell us what to do. We like to make that decision on our own. I remember a man that I read about. He worked in Appalachia. And he said the funny thing in Appalachia is everybody is so poor they can barely eat. He said, but when you go down the country roads in Appalachia, what you see is every family has a dog that they feed and a satellite dish. He said, if you don't have enough to eat, why do you have a satellite dish? And so he began to ask them. And the response was, because we want to just do it just to show people we can. Don't you ever do that? And it's not just human, it's spiritual. I can almost guarantee you tonight that if I told you to get up and move to the front, now you've got the tension. You won't. Why? Nobody's going to tell me what to do. And we can't. But at Corinth, it was a problem. I want my rights. Well, what rights do you really have, inevitably? And Paul has to write to the Corinthians to talk about that concept. You have demanded them, what right do you really have? Now you have to remember that letters were written without the interference of the noise of chapters and verses. We've chopped them up to make them convenient to read and convenient to locate. But when Paul wrote it, he just wrote thoughts. And so sometimes we have broken the thought where we shouldn't have broken the thought. And a broken thought is thoughtless. Tonight, I'd like for us to find the thought that Paul has to use. You know, every parent who is of a toddler knows the feeling. They know of their child running through the house, yelling at the top of their lungs, "No, me!" Where do you think they learned that? But see, from the earliest of ages, we say, I want what I want. I've got my rights. Me. It's all about me. And so when Paul talks to the Corinthians, he has to address this concept because they had a very popular saying. So much so that Paul quotes it back to them twice in the book of 1 Corinthians. And if they lived in a Twitter age, it would be wonderful tweet. It's well within 140 characters. And they would have retweeted, have you said retweet it? Sounds like I saw a putty tat. They would retweet it throughout the church. What they would say, what their slogan was I have the right. No one can tell me what to do. No one can force me to do anything. If it's not immoral or illegal, I can do it. Wouldn't you agree? My oldest daughter had a school teacher who she was dealing with whiny fourth graders, and her philosophy was, when somebody would come to tattle, was, if you're not bleeding or dying, I don't want to hear it. That's kind of what the Corinthians said. As long as it's not illegal or immoral, I can do this. And that covers a waterfront all by itself. And that attitude of, I can do what I please, bleeds over into their behavior. And because of that, you have to look at a principle. The first was this curious, difficult concept called eating meat sacrificed to idols. Now, we have tried to shoehorn that into all kinds of today. We have tried to find whatever parallel, and there's not really a whole lot of good parallels to this problem. But just briefly, that if you wanted to go out to eat, if you wanted to go to McDonald's at Corinth, the McDonald's at Corinth was in the middle of the temple of Apollo. And the beef that they would feed you on the hamburger had just come off of an altar. It was flame broiled, by the way. And the short order cook was a pagan priest. Do you eat it? It's in a temple. It's been sacrificed to an idol by a pagan priest. Do you eat it? Now, for some of the Corinthians, that was never a problem, because Paul would even admit, he said, we know that an idol is really nothing in this world. It's stone, it's wood, it's just an inanimate object. It has been invested with power by man, but it doesn't have any power. It's not real. We all know that. There are lords many and gods many, and it's all over the Roman world. And we realize that there's one single God, and we worship that God, and we don't worship these, and so we don't have to worry about what we know. But the problem was, there were some that couldn't make that distinction. There were some that when they saw that McDonald's hamburger there, all they could think of was Apollo. And all they could think of was, I'm participating in a pagan rite. And so Paul would say, there are people who are still accustomed to idols. And when they eat sacrificial food, they think they have been sacrificing to the God. They don't make the distinction. And you say, that doesn't really make any sense. It really does. When I was a boy, I grew up in Santa Fe, New Mexico. There were two classes of people, Catholic and everybody else. And the everybody else comprised about 5% of the population. And that was Christian, Jews, and atheists. Guess where I fit in? I was an Anglo. That's what they called me when they were being sweet. But one of the things that happened when young ladies would go through confirmation in the Catholic Church there, they would get a cross to hang around their neck. It was a sign of the Lord's protection. It was a sign that they were good Catholics. I moved to Texas 50 years ago. And I began to experience girls who wore gold crosses at church. It's just jewelry, isn't it? But if you would have asked some of the girls that I knew before I moved here what that meant, it wasn't jewelry anymore. It was religion. So you see, it's hard to make the distinction. He said, you may know the difference, but not everybody knows the difference. But if you go on and say, I've got the right, then we've got problems here. It bled over in their behavior and their worship. One of the things they did in their worship, they had what was called a love feast. And it's been much maligned by the pagans, including calling it incest. A love feast was simple. You had a church dinner every Sunday, and it had two purposes. One was fellowship. When you sit down at a table with your brothers and sisters, you're closer. We know that. The second was it was benevolence. There were plenty of poor people in the church who couldn't feed themselves, so at least once a week, everybody ate well. And the rich members would bring much, the poor members might bring nothing. But when they sat down to eat, they were equal. The only problem happened was when somebody was there early and got hungry. And so Paul says, when you come together, it's not the Lord's Supper that you eat, it's your supper that you eat. Because some of you come along and you have this private supper and you're not going to wait and you're not going to hold on. I'm going to eat now because I'm hungry right now and I don't need to do anything about that. And I'm so sorry those people can't be on time to the love feast. I'm going to go ahead and eat. Does that sound selfish? Let me dress that up. We have a church dinner on Sundays every once in a while. Suppose on that church dinner Sunday, you decided, my stomach's growling. So we offer the invitation, stand up for the invitation song, and you exit out the building and go down the south wing, and you turn to one of the ladies and says, man, I'm hungry, I want to eat now. Now, I've been down there, and I have seen this behavior before. I've got to tell you, this is not a hypothetical. I'm not saying any of you would do that. But I have seen it done in this building under those circumstances. And they will always say, why don't you wait for everybody? We're all going to go through the line together. And he said, no, I want to eat now because I'm hungry now. If you were one of those ladies, what would you say? That's what Paul's confronting. It's the concept that says, the only thing that matters in life is what I want. And I will do whatever. And it's all about me. It's not about anybody else. I can say what I want. I can do what I want. I can act how I want. And as long as it doesn't hurt me, I don't care. I have freedom. Now, when you take the varnish off of it and you look at the raw attitude, you know deep inside there's something wrong with that. But for them, they were saying, we have the right. And so Paul has to peel this back just a little bit and said, let's look at that for a moment. He says, you need to be careful with that kind of thinking. He uses a word that means to be careful in such a way that it's in the middle of the night when you get up in the dark. You walk a little more gingerly. People leave shoes out and you can fall over them. Beds will jump out and hit your feet. You'll walk into a door frame. I'll confess. And so you carefully make your way through the way. Paul says that's what you need to do because something is going on that you don't understand and you need to be careful of that. He said, for instance, I'll tell you about me. He says that I have all kinds of rights. Oh, and the reason I don't use them is because of one principle. He said if I could retweet this again, I would add something to it. He would say, now, you say I have the right to do anything, but not everything is beneficial. Not everything is for the benefit of people. So be careful. He said, I've had to learn that lesson myself. He says, I've got rights. He said, for instance, I've got rights such as I could take a wife with me on mission trips. I could carry her along and she'd slow me down, but that's okay. I could have a wife. Others do. I'm not different than they. They have a right to a wife. I have a right to a wife. And besides that, I have the right to be financially compensated. After all, even in the Old Testament, it would say, don't muzzle the ox while he's treading out the grain. Even the ox gets to eat while he's working. He said, I've got the right to do that. But he said, I have let all those things go. I have not exerted my rights. I have not used them. While you're wanting to use yours, I haven't used any of mine. I have voluntarily given them up. And the reason he gives them up is the great principle of the gospel, which is, I'm not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. He said, I'm not trying to do things for me. I'm trying to do things for others so that they too will be saved. And if I have to give up something, I will give up whatever right that is mine for the good of the other. And as he tries to apply that principle to their lives, he goes back to the temple of Apollo. And he says, let's talk about this. He says, you need to be careful how you exercise your rights, because they might become a stumbling block to the weak. Now, if you want to know what a stumbling block is, it's very simple. Go to that door right there. I hate that door, I got to tell you. There have been Monday mornings I want to bring a ball-peen hammer and decide it's done. When I'm feeling real venial, if it ever disappears, you know that I've had a bad morning. Because I'll come in there and the tip of my shoe will catch the lip that is there. It's there because we have two different surfaces, and I will start to stumble and fall. I don't like the feeling. That's the stumbling block. When you help someone fall when they didn't have to. And Paul says you've got to be very careful, because sometimes all this eating of meat, even though it may be okay for you, they're going to come and stump their toe and fall flat on their face spiritually, and they may not be able to get up. What are you going to do about that? That's the stumbling block. And he says, and when you do that, when you eat that meat without thinking about what it's going to do to somebody else, he says you're sinning against them. Just as much if you slapped them or hit them or stole from them. You have sinned against them. He said, let me tell you what's even worse. You have sinned against Christ. You are like the Pharisees with a hammer in hand, nailing him to the cross when you exercise your rights to the exclusion of someone else. That's a bitter pill. It's not so innocent in that frame. He tells them about their worship services and about the love feast. And he uses a phrase we talk about all the time, but it really has two meanings to it. He says, everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat of the bread and drink of the cup. Now, you know what we can do with that? We bow our heads and privately think about what happened 2,000 years ago. But Paul goes on to say, for those who eat and drink without discerning the body of Christ, eat and drink judgment upon themselves. Discerning the body. Now, I guess you could make that to where it says it's only about if you only think it's about crackers and grape juice, that's not discerning the body. I think he had a deeper meaning in that. Discerning the body. Would it change your communion experience? Then instead of bowing your head and closing your eyes, you opened them up and looked around and you saw all these people young, old, middle-aged, childless, row full of kids, and realize that Jesus died for every one of us in this room, and together we're going to go to heaven, or together we're not. Would that not make a change in what you do in those 15 minutes if you just discerned the body and realized how important others are? Paul says, if you don't do that, you have violated the principle of looking out for someone else's good. So, we have some rights. You know, you can say whatever you want to in our society. The rule of thumb, by the way, that has been established is your right of free speech ends at the end of my nose. That's the legal definition, basically. I know if you don't go to law school to find that out, but that's what the Supreme Court said. Your right to free speech ends at the end of my nose. But we can say whatever we want to. We can walk up to you and say, you are the ugliest person I have ever seen in my life. Or you're the dumbest person I've ever seen in my life. You have the right to say that. But is it responsible to say that? Now, in our society, it's different. I read Facebook. I'm on Twitter and Instagram and whatever all those other things are that waste my time. On Facebook, you have the right to put anything you want. You can say whatever you want on Facebook, and some people do. The question is not, do you have the right to post those things that you're going to post, but are you being responsible when you post them? And if you're not being responsible, should you not refrain from hitting that enter key? If you go to a Bible class, you have the right to say to the people in your class, I'm going to straighten you folks out. You guys don't know what you're talking about. I'm going to tell you what this passage is about. You sit down, be quiet, shut up, and you'll be knowledgeable when you get out. You could do that. That's your right. Or you could be responsible and ask the question and let someone discover what God wants them to do rather than you tell them. You have the right, but more importantly, you have the responsibility for another. Now, why is it Paul did that? Why does he do all that? Because he knew he was running a race. The Isthmian Games was the second largest sporting event in the ancient world next to Mount Olympus and the Olympic Games. Paul knew it well. I suspect he had gone and seen the runners. And so when he starts trying to pull this together, he says, do you not know that in a race, all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way to get the prize. It's a wonderful image, but if you divorce it from the context, it's kind of meaningless. And because he goes on to say, what do you think those runners do? He said, everyone competes in the games, goes into strict training. The word he uses is to control themselves. I admire our athletes for a simple reason. I'm the kind I would rather eat what I want, sleep when I want to, exercise or don't exercise. Not an athlete. An athlete eats only what he's supposed to. He exercises more than any of us can even dream of. And he denies himself all kinds of things you and I luxuriate in because he wants to win the prize. He's willing to give up something to get something greater. They asked Tom Landry one time, what a coach was supposed to do. He said the function of a coach is to help grown men do things they would never think about doing to attain things they have always wanted to attain. The giving up gets you there. And Paul knew one thing. He said, if I can give up all of those rights, he said, if I go into that strict training, then I'll get a crown. And he's not talking about that laurel wreath that'll mold and fade in 7 days or so. He's talking about a voice of a master he serves saying, well done. Come into my kingdom. See, one of the problems that we have is we divorce things like what do I do today with what's going to happen one day. And when that happens, you will pick the immediate all the time and you will forget the long range. But if you remember, I am an athlete in training. I have a race to run and a race to finish. And the only way it's going to happen is if I give up things now, then look at what I get later. Oh, it's a whole different scene. And when you think about what Paul's doing, he says, I'm running a race and I give up so many things because the only way I will win the crown is if I take somebody into heaven with me. Interestingly enough, the greatest right we have is the right not to please ourselves. It's the greatest right. We don't have to. We don't have to exert our rights. We have the freedom to do that. But the greatest responsibility is to help someone else get to heaven. Would that not give you just a measure of pause in your life when you want to do something on your own? Who's watching you? Who's copying you? Who's going to change because of you? And is it going to be good or is it going to be bad? You have the freedom to decide that. And you have the responsibility to act appropriately. It happens to people. Megan Vogel was a junior in high school. She was running track for West Liberty Salem High School. She was running the 3,200 meters. She had already run 1,600 meters earlier in the day. She was tired. She wasn't running well. In fact, she was dead last. And no one likes to finish last, ever. And so, as she came up on that last little stretch, she was about to pass her opponent, a girl by the name of Arden McMath, when Arden fell down. This was her opportunity. This was her opportunity to pass the runner and say, I didn't come in last. Instead, Megan stopped. She reached down on the track and picked Arden up, put her arm around her shoulder, and together they walked themselves to the finish line. But when they got to the finish line, she took Arden and put her in front and pushed her across before she would go through. Megan finished last. Or did she? I'm not sure that by helping someone else finish the race, you don't finish first.
So here at Waterview, we've been adding new songs